Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this TechNet webinar. Today, we're delighted to welcome Project Last Mile on the topic, findings on the operational flexibility of maintaining ultra-cold temperatures to distribute COVID-19 vaccines, the availability of dry ice within the Coca-Cola value chain in 70 countries. I will let Alexandra Scott, Director of Program Delivery for Project Last Mile, introduce you the presenter. But before we start, I'd like to share some information about this webinar. First, it's recorded, and we'll share with you all by email the link to the recording as well as the presentation. And finally, during this webinar, please ask your questions in the Q&A box. They will be answered after the presentation. So don't hesitate to ask your questions during the presentation. Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I liked that opening to all who have joined us from across the world. We're very happy to have this opportunity to share this exciting work with you. And for those who aren't here but are going to be listening in later, very glad to have you join as well. My name is Alex Scott. I'm the Director of Program Delivery for the Project Last Mile Partnership. And before we dive into the technical content of the webinar, I wanted to just take a moment to explain and provide a bit of context around what Project Last Mile is and how we operate. So Project Last Mile is a public-private partnership between all of these partners. You can see the Coca-Cola Company, the Coca-Cola Foundation, the Global Fund, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, USAID, and PEPFAR. Apologies for my dog. I am working from home, as everyone probably is. And the premise was Project Last Mile was founded in 2009, and it was really started to answer the question, if we can, if the Coca-Cola system is so effective at distribution and logistics in emerging and difficult markets, how might we borrow some of that expertise and apply that to the public health space? And so that sparked Project Last Mile in 2009. Since then, the partnership has grown, and we now operate not only looking at logistics, last mile delivery in particular. Our focus is route to market primarily, but from this example, you'll see we've also done some more upstream work as well. We've also expanded to strategic marketing. So understanding, Coca-Cola as a company is very strong in building brands, generating brand loyalty and love, and leveraging strategic marketing expertise to continue that. And so how might we apply that to demand creation and behavior change space? It's a second kind of core competency that has evolved. So the way we operate, we have a global governance structure that has all of the partners that are listed here who provide not only funding, but also advocacy support, strategic partnership, and guidance in connecting us and identifying where might be the best opportunities to leverage the unique competencies of the Coke system that we can then adapt and apply to the health space. And that's how this study emerged through partnership with the Gates Foundation. Technical input, we extract from across the, sorry, can you go back, Jonathan? Or is this, yeah, from across the value chain of the Coca-Cola system. So the Coca-Cola Company itself, the bottlers on the ground who do much of the production, distribution, logistics, getting products out into market. We work, like I said, by leveraging networks and expertise, data and technology from Coca-Cola vendors and partners. Example would be communications agencies, market research firms, 3PLs, really depends on the nature of the work. And then folks like Jonathan, who are alumni from the Coca-Cola system and have spent many, many years leading and developing the business across Coca-Cola, working in Africa, but also global emerging markets. And they are the center and the core of these projects and apply that expertise from the Coca-Cola system and adapt that to the health space. I think the main other piece here to highlight is that Project Last Mile operates largely in partnership with and as advisors to ministries of health on the ground and in collaboration with local NGOs and community-based organizations as a lean technical advisory partner that's really focused on extracting the best practices from the Coke system and translating those to the health space. We can only successfully thrive if we work in collaboration. Next slide, please. So I've kind of touched on this, but this is effectively the approach that Project Last Mile takes, we partner by identifying with our funding and steering committee partners and ministries of health where there might be gaps that this unique expertise can add value. And then we'll design and develop teams based on the competencies across route to market, logistics, cold chain, strategic marketing, whatever is needed to test and deploy a solution in partnership with the market, with the Ministry of Health, and then we'll monitor that. Next slide, please. Great. So that's a bit about the overview of Project Last Mile, and I'm happy to answer if there are any follow-up questions. We can also speak to that or explain a bit more about how the model works in practice. The focus of this, though, is on the LCO2 supply feasibility assessment. And coming out of what I just explained as the model, the Gates Foundation engaged Project Last Mile as a core partner to assess the feasibility and understand, knowing that a number of vaccine candidates for COVID, this was end of last year, we're going to require dry ice to support transport, storage, distribution to remain viable. The Coca-Cola system obviously having well, not obviously, but to validate the assumption that there's significant liquid CO2, which is a core input to dry ice production on the continent and around the globe. How might we leverage either that actual supply or understand the networks of and tap into the networks of liquid CO2 down to dry ice production that are used by the Coke system in service of informing and supporting distribution, storage, transport of COVID-19 vaccines that require ultra cold chain. So that was the initial brief that we got. Jonathan and another member of our team were subject matter experts. I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself, who led and developed this study. And we're very happy to share with you the findings of that now. Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. So yes, my name is Jonathan Hulse. I'm the route to market subject matter expert for PLM with significant experience across the Coca-Cola system, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. I was the project lead on this particular engagement, and I'm just going to spend the next 30 minutes taking you through the project itself, so how it was set up, the approach that we took, what the key outputs were, and therefore what the implications are for vaccine selection across the 70 countries that we assessed. So the background is, clearly an announcement was made back in February that the Pfizer vaccine would be a critical vaccine for managing COVID across the COVAX countries globally. And as Alex has obviously just spent the last couple of minutes taking you through, the Pfizer vaccine requires ultra cold chain. So temperatures of down to -70 degrees centigrade is required for the vaccine, and that has to be across the entire supply chain. So it has to be at -70 not only at the point of vaccination, but also during transportation and during storage. So that presents a huge challenge for low and middle income countries across the globe. The second sort of key point around the background of this project is that there's significant gaps in the supporting infrastructure across low and middle income countries to support an ultra cold chain. So that's a perceived issue. Third issue was that packing the vaccines when they were transported, it would need to be done in dry ice. So clearly dry ice in quite significant quantities would be required for this. And a key element of manufacturing dry ice is the need for liquid CO2. So clearly, in order to support an ultra cold chain for low and middle income countries for this Pfizer vaccine, liquid CO2 and consequently dry ice would be critical to ensure that the temperature was to be maintained across the supply chain. Obviously, the Coca-Cola company is a huge user of liquid CO2, and particularly one of the largest users across Africa, which was the initial focus of this project. And therefore, with our links to the Coca-Cola system, we were asked to look at the feasibility for the Coca-Cola ecosystem to support the supply of liquid CO2 and potentially dry ice to support an ultra cold chain model for this vaccine. So the objectives were for us to do a very high level landscape analysis of the ability of the Coca-Cola ecosystem to support initially 20 African countries that were selected for us to see if it was feasible that there was sufficient liquid CO2 and dry ice capacity across those 20 countries to support the vaccine distribution. And essentially where liquid CO2 and potentially dry ice was available, we were tasked with looking at the financials behind that to see if it was viable financially as well. What was our approach? Our approach was that we looked at 3 potential sources of liquid CO2. The first was the Coca-Cola bottlers themselves, because the Coca-Cola, the bottling system has a number of manufacturing facilities across Africa, and typically liquid CO2 is used in the manufacturing process. So we looked at the first level was to look at the actual bottlers themselves. The second sort of group of people we looked at was within the countries that the Coca-Cola company operates, was to look at the suppliers or the external suppliers locally within the countries that provide liquid CO2 to the bottling network. And then the third source of CO2 that we evaluated were suppliers of CO2 outside of the African continent. So that was the 3 areas we looked at. So the first was to map liquid CO2 supply versus demand in each of the countries that we were assessing, to understand what not only the supply of liquid CO2, but what the capabilities were around storage of CO2 and ultimately transporting it as well. Where we mapped capacity against demand, obviously we wanted to identify where there was spare capacity available, which could potentially be used for supporting the ultra cold chain distribution of the vaccine. The next level was, once we identified where that capacity was, what potential role the Coke bottlers could play in terms of supporting that access. So that could include procuring the liquid CO2. It could be leveraging their network to encourage additional supply to be made available. There are a number of elements that we looked at to see how the Coke system could help with making liquid CO2 available. Where local capacity was insufficient or not available at all, we also looked at options for creating capacity. So that would be looking at installing new plant equipment where needed. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we looked at the financials around doing this. So what would the cost be to support the ultra cold chain model for the vaccine? And so that was the approach that we took. Ultimately, halfway through the project, so the project started back in November and ran for around about 6 weeks. And midway through that, we were having very encouraging results around the analysis we were doing on the African continent. So the initial 20 countries that we were looking at. So we were tasked with expanding the assessment, the analysis that we were doing. And eventually we ended up doing 70 countries across 3 regions. So that was Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific Islands. And of those 70 countries, as you can see here, 64 of those were COVAX countries. In fact, all the COVAX countries across those 3 regions were assessed. So that's what we ended up evaluating, is the scope expanded. In terms of demand, we did not develop the demand model. We were given a demand model for understanding what capacity of dry ice would be required, and therefore what capacity of liquid CO2 would be required by country. And you can see here the model on the left-hand side. It covers everything from, so the dry ice and therefore liquid CO2 covers all the capacity that's required all the way through from the moment the vaccines arrive in country, all the way through the first mile distribution through to regional or zonal storage hubs, and then potentially transported on further to additional storage hubs across the country, and then finally on the last mile out to health facilities or other vaccination sites across the country. And it was developed around an assumption of 2 doses per person vaccinated, because obviously we were considering the Pfizer vaccine, and that's what it requires. And the model was really developed around a 30-day time period. And you'll see in a moment some of the assumptions that we use to understand demand. But you can see here, in quite some detail, what the assumptions were behind the demand model, and how we determined the amount of dry ice that was required and the amount of liquid CO2 that was required to make that dry ice. So what I'm going to show you here is an example of one of the countries. So what we pulled out was Mozambique. And the key assumption we were given, in addition to the 30-day period for the vaccinations to take place, was the population, the percentage of the population to be vaccinated. And we were given a target of 1%. So what you see here in red in the center of the chart are the assumptions or the outputs of demand for Mozambique based on 1% of the population to be vaccinated over 30 days, over a 30-day period. And you can see here, so 312 people you vaccinated, they require around about 625,000 doses. In terms of dry ice per day, it requires just over 1 metric ton of dry ice per day to enable those 312,000 people to be vaccinated with their 2 doses over the 30-day period. So it's about 30,000 kgs of dry ice would be required over the period. And we were using an assumption of 3 to 1 in terms of liquid CO2 for each kilo of dry ice. So it was about 90,000 kilos of liquid CO2 that would be required over the 30-day period. However, if you look at the next column shown in grey here, is if you were to expand that to 10% of the population to be vaccinated, the numbers change quite significantly. In this instance, we've also changed the number of days from 30 to 180. So this would be over 6 months. And it gives you an idea of the variability around how much ice would be needed. So clearly, if you're taking much longer to vaccinate, although you're vaccinating more people, you can see on the bottom right-hand side of this chart that actually it's slightly less ice per day. So it's only 826 kilos required. But obviously that's over a much longer time period. That's over 180 days. So your absolute number of ice increases quite significantly. But this gives you an idea of the assumptions behind the demand that we had to meet for this particular country, which is Mozambique. If we now look at the outputs, so obviously we've taken you through the approach that we used, we've taken you through some of the assumptions. If we now look at the output, what did we actually find when we did this assessment? So I think the first point was around liquid CO2, and that was the initial reason for this feasibility study, was that the key point was there's abundant liquid CO2 available across all 70 countries, across all 3 regions. I mean, you can see here that for the 30 days that we modeled on 1% of the population, in total across the 3 regions, about 8 million kilos would be required over the 30 days of liquid CO2, and the capacity in place is 22.5 million. So there's significant capacity available of liquid CO2 across the 3 regions. And if you actually start expanding outside of the regions that we assessed, so you start looking at Europe and the Middle East, it's also possible there's additional supplies available there of liquid CO2, which can be easily imported into, for instance, Africa, the continent. So I think that the first point that came out of our assessment was that there's abundant liquid CO2. So liquid CO2 is not an issue in terms of supporting an ultra cold chain model for the vaccine. So let's now have a look at dry ice. So dry ice is obviously a little bit different. And what we found was the first stage is that there were 23 countries out of the 70 that had that were self-sufficient and had significant supply capacity of dry ice available within the country. And you can see here 2 countries in the Pacific Islands, 6 countries in Latin America, and the balance. So what's that? That's 15 countries across the African continent. Were available, had sufficient local dry ice capacity available. And what was interesting is if you actually take those countries and understand what proportion of the population they cover in terms of these 70 countries, so a sort of a weighted coverage, they actually represent 60% of the population that would need to be vaccinated. So 1% in each of those countries represents 60% of 1% of the 70 countries. So you're actually getting, significant coverage locally with existing capacity of dry ice. What we then looked at was to say, well, there are many examples, particularly in South Africa, where dry ice is transported across borders into neighboring countries. So what we then did was an analysis of those countries which had excess dry ice capacity. What additional countries next to them could potentially be serviced within 24 hours of traveling by refrigerated vehicle. So taking that as a data point, we found that there was an additional 14 neighboring countries that could be covered by the initial 23 countries with excess dry ice capacity. So that meant that in total, we could get immediate coverage of dry ice across 37 of the 70 countries. And again, using that population metric, you can see on the right-hand side, with the additional 14 countries, we now have a weighted coverage of 71% of the population across those 70 countries. So that's immediate dry ice capacity that would be available for the ultra cold chain distribution model. So obviously that leaves 33 countries where there is either insufficient or no local dry ice supply capacity. And they're also too remote from the 23 countries that have excess dry ice capacity. So for those countries, we looked at 3 additional options. The first option was to understand, would it be possible to transport dry ice capacity by air? So could we take, for instance, the excess dry ice capacity in South Africa and fly it by air across, sub-Saharan Africa? That would be one example. The second option we looked at was the potential to rent dry ice production hubs and have sequenced deployment across the 3 regions. That was the second option we looked at. The third option was to actually install new capacity, so permanent new capacity within those countries. And where possible, the same principle would be applied to those countries where we would install new dry ice plants. If there were countries neighboring them that had no capacity and were within 24 hours of travel time, they would be supplied by the new dry ice capacity installed. So they were the 3 additional options that we identified for those 33 countries. What I'd like to do now is just take you through each of those 3 options in a little bit more detail. So the first one is the option of transporting dry ice by air. So the operating model would be to identify potential sources of dry ice where there's excess capacity, and put that on a plane, on a cargo plane, and fly that out to those 33 countries that have insufficient or no dry ice capacity locally. Again, we use the principle of maximum 24 hours for transportation, but of course, when you're flying, that's a long distance, so that would cover pretty much every country that we assessed, all 70, and particularly the 33 that didn't have capacity. So what did we find? We found that of the remaining countries that did not have capacity, is that South Africa, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, New Zealand, and Trinidad and Tobago had sufficient capacity in place to support all those countries which had no local dry ice capacity. Secondly, what we found was that as an alternative, there was a much lower cost dry ice supply capacity in place in Belgium, in Europe, which could supply the African continent, which meant that obviously instead of shipping out of South Africa, Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire, we could do it out of one location, which would be Belgium. So that was another key data point. And although it had further to travel, the actual unit cost of delivery by shipping it or by transporting by air out of Belgium was lower cost than by doing it from sources within Africa. And what we also found is that although there was a limit of 200 kg of dry ice that could be shipped by commercial airlines, was that when it was with cargo airlines, it's, you know, there's a much greater capacity that can be shipped, and therefore we found that there was very little constraints around actually transporting dry ice by air. So what were the implications? The implications obviously were that we could have immediate supply across all 70 countries of sufficient dry ice if we were to transport by air. And what we looked at was 23 countries in Africa would be supplied from Belgium, and the 8 countries in the Pacific Islands that don't have local or sufficient dry ice capacity would be supplied out of New Zealand, and then the 7 countries in Latin America would be supplied out of Trinidad and Tobago. So that's a very, you know, in terms of an immediate solution, it is possible to get dry ice across all 70 countries to support the ultra cold chain distribution model for this vaccine. We now look at the second option. The second option was to look at the rental of mobile dry ice production hubs and to locate those into those countries that had no local capacity. These are equipment, they're essentially the same equipment that would be installed on a permanent basis, but they're in a self-contained sort of almost like a 30-foot transport container. So they're mobile, they can go by road, and they have, you know, they can be connected up to existing liquid CO2 storage locally, and it's a very elegant solution for those countries that do not have dry ice capacity. The particular model we looked at was supplied by an organization called ColdJet, and the capacity was 2,400 kilograms per day for the mobile hub. And that was sufficient to cover all the countries, 45 of the 47 that did not have local capacity available, with the only 2 countries that couldn't, that it wasn't sufficient in terms of capacity was Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo. However, for those 2 particular countries, it would still be possible to use the mobile hub, but it would have to be sequenced, used, and moved around the country to cover demand. In terms of the availability of these units, there's 9 units available, 4 in the United Kingdom, 2 in Singapore, and sorry, it's 9 units, and there's 1 each in Norway, Nigeria, and United States. So clearly, you know, these, as part of the sequencing of using these production hubs, 2 things would have to be taken into account. One is there'd have to be some prioritization around which countries they'd be deployed to. And secondly, there's obviously a time required to actually move or transport these production hubs from their existing locations into the 3 regions. What are the implications? Obviously, the major implication of this particular option is there's a high degree of flexibility around using mobile hubs. There would be a requirement for sequencing. So some countries would obviously be delayed in getting dry ice supplied through to them. But one major benefit of using a mobile dry ice production hub that is rented is that, you know, there's no capital expenditure required. So it's just operating expenses. So it does reduce the capital burden in terms of providing dry ice across the countries. So that was the second option. The third option was to look at actual installation of new equipment into these countries. And when we looked at the various options, there's a wide variety of dry ice plants that are available globally. We looked at 3 companies that manufacture dry ice equipment. So it was ASCO based in Switzerland, Coldjet out of the US, and Metzco, which was an African based organization. And they produce a wide range of equipment. Everything from, as you can see here, 1,000 kg per day all the way up to 7,000 kg per day. So a wide variety of equipment. However, what we did find was that the demand for dry ice across 41 of the 47 countries would be sufficiently covered by the smallest unit available, which was the ASCO A55P. So therefore, the actual, although there's a wide variety of equipment that's available, it would be pretty much one unit that we would look at, that would be looked at being installed. The lead time for deployment, if we would have, if it was agreed to install new capacity, was around 12 weeks, and that was. So 12 weeks to deploy and then 10 weeks to manufacture. So again, there'd need to be some long-term or medium-term planning around understanding if actual installation of new plants is required, because there is a lead time for manufacturing the units and getting them shipped out to the locations. One of the companies, ASCO, offers a really neat solution as well, which is they offer to repurchase the equipment after 12 months, adjusted for wear and tear. So obviously with the vaccination program, it's, the expectation is within 12 months that majority of people will be vaccinated within that time period. Therefore, there would be no further need for dry ice. So it would be possible to sell those units back to the manufacturer who offered to repurchase them. So what are the implications for this? Obviously, the implications are that compared to the other 2 options, there's a more extended lead time in terms of getting the dry ice capacity available within the countries. Obviously, there's capital expenditure required because the units had to be initially purchased in order to have them installed. However, that burden is reduced because one of the companies ultimately offers to repurchase those back, adjusted for wear and tear after 12 months. But one other implication is, clearly when you're actually installing dry ice capacity into a country, the actual location, the building that it's put into, the connection to liquid CO2, all have to be assessed and analysed, and therefore that takes time, and it delays further the availability of the dry ice in the countries where it's required. So that's a summary of the 3 options that we looked at. In terms of the financials, obviously it was a key element was to look at the understanding the financials behind each of these 3 options. So if we look at option 1, which was using the existing dry ice capacity where it currently exists in the 23 countries and then shipping it by air to the other countries, the cost of that we estimated would be about $14.6 million. When you look at it as a cost per person vaccinated, that's just over $1.04. And then we go through option 2, which is the rental option, worked at around about 14.9 million, so another 300,000 incremental over the air option. So that's around $1.06 per person vaccinated, all the way through to installing the new dry ice manufacturing capacity, which was option 3, which is 16.3 million or $1.15. However, option 3 also within that 16.3 million there's a potential capital expenditure of up to 4 million that would be required. So they're the costs of supplying dry ice for the vaccination across the 3 regions, across each of the different options. So what did we see in terms of a summary of the implications of the analysis we did? In order to vaccinate 1% of the total country population across the 70 countries that we assessed. The first point, as we mentioned earlier, is that there's abundant liquid CO2 capacity available. Within the 70 countries, 23 countries have sufficient dry ice capacity locally to support the vaccination program. Where air transport is feasible, all 70 countries can get immediate supply out of Belgium, Trinidad and Tobago and New Zealand, using them as regional hubs and obviously transporting it by air. And that would cost around about $1.04 per person vaccinated. We then look at the second option, which was the rental of the mobile dry ice production hubs. That would be required across 27 countries. The estimated cost of that would be 14.9 million, or just over $1.06 per person vaccinated. In terms of the installing the new dry ice capacity and then shipping it by truck to neighbouring countries, that requires, there's a delay. It's not immediate supply. About $16.3 million, $1.15 per person vaccinated. And then finally, we just really wanted to call out that there were 15 remote small island locations, particularly within the Pacific Islands, where air transport really would be the only really viable commercial option, given the amount of dry ice that they actually require on a daily basis. So we just wanted to highlight that as an implication. How does it affect vaccine selection across the three regions? Well, I think the first one is that clearly there's abundant liquid CO2, so that's not a constraint when you're looking at the potential use of the Pfizer vaccine across these three regions. There's sufficient dry ice capacity. There's certainly sufficient dry ice manufacturing capacity in 23 countries that can also support 14 neighbouring countries. So in 37 countries, there's absolutely immediate dry ice capacity available. So that's not a constraint. And if there's a willingness to transport the dry ice by air, then it's immediately available across all 70 countries. So therefore, the supply of dry ice is not a constraining factor when considering allocating which vaccines to use. The 2 points we just wanted to cover off, though, is that clearly ultra cold chain using dry ice, so using dry ice for storage, using dry ice for transport, and using dry ice for the vaccination delivery sites whilst patients are being vaccinated, is going to be a huge challenge for managing the temperature of that vaccine throughout that supply chain. And we just wanted to highlight that although dry ice is available, there needs to be a lot of work done around managing the supply chain using that dry ice. And then ultimately, given that the evolving nature of the vaccines is that Pfizer is one vaccine that's available. There's additional vaccines coming through from AstraZeneca, from Johnson & Johnson, and so on, which require different temperature ranges, is that there needs to be some flexibility around the distribution model that we're going to be using for the vaccines to support both ultra cold chain and regular cold chain, in order to be able to manage the variable supply of the vaccines that become available across these 70 countries. So I believe that's it. I think that's everything that I wanted to cover off. So thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Jonathan. So far we haven't received any questions in the chat or in the Q&A. Maybe we'll just give a minute or so to see if anybody has questions or if there are any hands raised. And if not, in future, if there are questions, I believe Dan posted in the group, please do feel free to post on the forum. We get those notifications and can connect with you, circle back. Okay. Well, in that case, Thank you to Jonathan for the.
There's a question, Alexandra.
Oh.
I just spoke in.
Oh, great. Has there been any research or thought on what a combination of the three options would look like?
I mean, yes. I mean, clearly, we called out the three different options across the, of what was possible. Clearly, a combination of the options can be deployed. So I think we actually are not making any specific recommendations around what should be done. We're just, providing the options. The project itself was set up to look at what options were available and whether they were feasible. So all three options are feasible and available to the 70 countries. So further analysis would definitely be required to make sure the right option was selected for each country.
All right, any other question? You still have the possibility to ask a question in the Q&A box or in the chat. Or if the question is really complex, maybe you can even raise your hand. No, I think there's no more question. Alexandra?
Great. Well, with that, thank you very much to Alex and Joe and the team for putting this together and helping us set this up, and to Jonathan for the presentation, and to all of you for joining. And like we said, if there are future questions or interested in having conversations about the results of the study, please do just post on the forum and we can get back to you.
Thank you. I will also, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, I will send you I will send everybody the link to the recording as well as the slides. So yes, we'll share the slides on the TechNet website and also by email. And the recording of this webinar will be on YouTube and will be shared. Yes, will you share the slides or results on the site? Yes. So thank you very much. Hope to discuss with you again, to talk to you again during our next webinar with the PATH at the end of this month on HPV new findings. Thanks again. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Jonathan. And have a good day, everybody, or a good evening. Bye-bye.